Welcome. In this web tutorial, I'll describe and briefly demonstrate two user-friendly, freely available web tools for targeting and evaluating forest conservation policy in Latin America. The video complements written instructions and metadata that are available for download in the dashboard of each tool. So those instructions provide a detailed version of the overview that I'm going to provide here. The web tools are accessible on a National Aeronautics and Space Administration server and can be accessed via the URLs in this slide. So the Forest Conservation Targeting Tool is available at fctt.sevierglobal.net, and the Forest Conservation Evaluation Tool is available at fcet.sevierglobal.net. The web tutorial has three parts. First, I'll briefly describe the project that generated this work, and then I'll describe and demonstrate the targeting tool, and finally, I'll describe and then demonstrate the evaluation tool. So first, an overview of the project. So the motivation for building these web tools is essentially that deforestation and forest degradation in Latin America are rampant. According to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, deforestation in the region remains, quote, alarmingly high. So in the first decade of the 2000s, the average rate of deforestation in the region was 0.5% per year, which is about 5 times the global rate. That deforestation, along with forest degradation, has a number of serious environmental consequences. At the global level, it contributes to climate change and biodiversity loss. And at the local level, it contributes to soil erosion and the loss of hydrological services. Unfortunately, the resources, the human and financial and institutional resources that we have available to stem deforestation and forest degradation in Latin America are quite scarce. Therefore, it's really important that we maximize the bang for the buck from the resources that we do devote to addressing that problem. And that's the broad goal of these tools. It's to help improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of forest conservation policy in Latin America. So we've built two user-friendly web tools. One is for targeting forest conservation policies, that is identifying the places where these types of policies are going to generate the greatest conservation bang for the buck. And the second tool is for measuring the effectiveness of specific policies in stemming deforestation in specific places. So for example, how effective have protected areas in Costa Rica or payments for environmental services in Costa Rica been in stemming deforestation? The web tools are designed to be user-friendly and to have all of the requisite data on board. So building these tools has been a team effort, and before starting to describe them, I just want to make sure to give credit to the folks that were on this team. The main team consisted of 4 folks who at the time were at Resources for the Future, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental policy research institute in Washington, D.C. Those folks were myself, Alan Blackman, Jessica Chu, Alex Igorenkov, Len Goff, and Juha Sikamaki. In addition, that core team was supported by other researchers, both at Resources for the Future and at the University of Maryland Department of Geography, and they included Matt Hansen, Joe Mayer, Stephanie Najjar, Peter Potapov, and Yamil Tolera. I also want to take a second to acknowledge the funders of these tools. The principal funder was NASA's SEVERE program. And in addition, we received funding from SSYNC, the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis, Maryland, from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and from the Inter-American Development Bank. Okay, so now I'm going to describe and then demonstrate our tool for targeting forest conservation policies, the Forest Conservation Targeting Tool. So the question that this tool helps users answer is, where should future forest conservation policies that are in the planning stage that haven't been implemented yet, where should they be sited, where should they be located in order to generate the greatest conservation bang for the buck? So here we're thinking about forest conservation policies like protected areas, payments for environmental services, forest certification, and community forestry. Policies that that are geographically delimited. They have an effect in some places, but not in others. So this is a forward-looking tool. It's for planning future interventions. The geographic scope of the tool is Latin America and the Dominican Republic. So that includes Mexico, Central America, the Dominican Republic, and South America. The core function of the tool is to suggest locating forest conservation policies in some spatial units of analysis and not in others. So what are the spatial units of analysis that the tool uses? Well, there's some flexibility there. The user can determine what the spatial units are subject to some constraints. So for Mexico, actually, the user doesn't have a choice. The spatial units of analysis are forest management units. They're properties. And that's the only option for Mexico. For Central America, the user has three choices. The user can use second-level administrative units, which are basically the equivalent of counties in the United States. They can use 10 kilometer squared cells or 1 kilometer squared cells. And finally, in South America, the user can choose between 10 kilometer squared cells and 1 kilometer squared cells. So the intuition for the analytics of the web tool is quite simple. What the tool does is for each of these spatial units of analysis, it calculates the expected bang for the buck, or to use less colloquial language, it calculates the expected benefit per unit cost, which I'm going to refer to as the EBC. The EBC depends on three things. The first is the risk of deforestation. The greater is that risk in a spatial unit, the higher will be the EBC. So if deforestation risk is low, then the expected benefit of conserving forest cover in that unit is low, since that forest cover wouldn't disappear even if there were no intervention. The second thing that EBC depends on is the ecological benefits that the forests in a spatial unit provide. And the tool takes into account three types of benefits. The first is carbon storage. Forests store carbon. The second is provision of biodiversity habitat. And the third is the provision of hydrological services. The final thing that EBC depends on is the cost of conserving forest in a given spatial unit. So the higher is that cost, the lower is going to be the EBC. So the forest conservation tool combines these three elements in a simple and intuitive way, which is illustrated in this equation. So the term in parentheses is the sum of the three types of forest ecological benefits that I just mentioned. So B1 is carbon sequestration, B2 is biodiversity preservation, and B3 is hydrological services. So we have onboard data that provides for each spatial unit a measure of each of those things. Alpha, beta, and gamma are weights. So those measures are weighted, and the weights depend on the user's preferences. So the user determines alpha, beta, and gamma, and I'll show you how that's done when I demonstrate the tool in a minute. That sum in parentheses, the weighted sum of those indices of ecological benefits, is then multiplied by deforestation risk, which is R, and divided by the cost of conservation. And that gives us the EBC for each of the spatial units. So it's important to point out that EBC is an ordinal measure and not a cardinal one. So the indices of the three ecological benefits are denominated in different units. So for carbon, we have tons of carbon. For biodiversity habitat, we have a count, a weighted count of threatened and endangered species. And hydrological services is denominated in yet another different type of unit. So when we sum those three things together, we don't get a measure that's meaningful in itself. Rather, it's only meaningful when it's compared to the EBC for other units. And so again, this is an ordinal and not a cardinal index. So having calculated EBC for each of the spatial units in a user-defined study area, how does the forest conservation targeting tool identify those units where forest conservation should be located? Well, it does that in a very simple way using an algorithm called a knapsack algorithm. And that entails simply calculating EBC along with the conservation cost for each spatial unit in a user-defined study area, then ranking each of the spatial units according to its EBC, ranking them from highest to lowest. The user specifies a budget for conservation, and then the forest conservation targeting tool simply selects spatial units of analysis to be included in the set that are recommended for interventions, starting with the highest ranked one in terms of EBC, and then the second highest ranked one, and so forth until the budget is exhausted. So just to make that a little more concrete, I'll give a quick example. Let's say the user defines a study area that consists of 20 second-level administrative units in El Salvador. These are municipios, basically the equivalent of counties. And let's say the user tells the forest conservation targeting tool that she has a conservation budget of $50,000. So the forest conservation targeting tool calculates EBC for each of the 20 second-level administrative units in the study area. It ranks them from the highest EBC to the lowest. So you can see in this left-hand column, we have the names of the 20 second-level administrative units, the 20 municipios. We have the expected benefit per unit cost, and then the units are ranked from highest EBC to lowest EBC, from 320 to 160. So again, the conservation budget is $50,000. The EBC also knows for each unit the cost of conserving forest in that unit. And what the tool does is it simply selects the first second-level administrative unit, which is called the first municipio, which is called Arizona. It has the highest EBC. That eats up about $5,000 of the $50,000 budget. It selects the second-ranked municipio, El Porvenir, and that eats up about $4,500 of the budget. So far, we've spent about $9,600. Then it selects the third-ranked one, and so forth, until it exhausts the entire budget, which happens after the top 11 municipios have been selected. So for this targeting exercise, the forest conservation targeting tool would recommend intervening in these 11 municipios where the expected benefit per unit cost is the greatest. So this is a simple analytical framework. The value added of this tool is not to develop some complex or particularly subtle analytical framework for targeting. Rather, it's that the tool provides onboard rich geospatial data on all of those elements of expected benefit per unit cost that I just mentioned: deforestation risk, ecological benefits, and conservation costs. It aggregates these data in a simple, transparent, and conceptually sound way, and it provides a user-friendly interface. So before I demonstrate the tool, let me just describe the data that the forest conservation targeting tool has on board. As I'll explain when I demonstrate the tool allows users to upload data, their own data, if they feel that they have data that's more useful, more reliable, or in whatever way is preferable to the onboard data. But these are the data that the tool has on board. I'll start with our data on deforestation risk. So the project team econometrically estimated these data using the University of Maryland's fine-scale annual panel data on deforestation from 2001 to 2012. The premise of the econometric model is that the probability that any given plot of land in a study area is deforested in a given year depends on the characteristics of that plot of land, including the time-varying characteristics of that plot of land in a given year and in past years. So those characteristics include rainfall, temperature, population density, and the prices of agricultural commodities. So, for example, we might expect more deforestation in areas that have high population density in a given year and where the prices of agricultural commodities are relatively high. The probability of deforestation also depends on time invariant characteristics of a given piece of land, including how far it is to population centers, its slope, its altitude, its directional orientation, and so forth. So what we do is we estimate an econometric model that captures the historical relationship between these type of plot characteristics and the probability of deforestation over this period, 2000 to 2012. So in other words, our model essentially tells us for all plots with forest cover that have such and such characteristics, given what we know about how these characteristics have affected the probability of deforestation in the past, what's the probability of deforestation going forward? Our data on forest carbon are the best available off-the-shelf spatial data sets that we could find when we were putting the tool together. So for Mexico, those data are Woods Hole Research Center, 2013, 30 meter squared data on above ground carbon stock and woody vegetation. For Central America and the Dominican Republic, they're GIZ 2014, 30 meter squared above ground and below ground carbon stock in woody vegetation. And for South America, they're Sachi et al.'s 2011 1 kilometer squared data on above ground and below ground carbon stock in live biomass. Our data on the provision of biodiversity habitat are simply for each of the spatial units of analysis, a rarity weighted richness index. And that's simply a weighted count of threatened species in a given spatial unit, where the weights reflect the rarity of each species globally or nationally. So rare species get a higher weight. These data are derived from the IUCN's, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's, digital maps of species ranges for mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. Our data on forest hydrological services were generated using WaterWorld, which is an off-the-shelf model of the link between forest cover and hydrological services. We used WaterWorld to estimate an index that takes into account the effect of forest cover on water quality and on water balance, which is just the difference between precipitation and transpiration. Finally, our data on the costs of conserving forests in a given spatial unit are estimates of the gross per hectare revenue that crops and pasture would generate on that unit, which in turn is a proxy for the opportunity cost of retaining forest cover. So in other words, our proxy for conservation costs is an estimate of how much revenue land managers give up by retaining forest cover on their land instead of converting it into agriculture or pasture. So for Mexico, we estimate these gross revenues ourselves using a combination of forest management unit or property level and county level secondary data. And for Central America and South America and the Dominican Republic, we use an off-the-shelf global data set that was produced by Robin Naidoo and his co-author in 2007. Before demonstrating the forest conservation targeting tool, I just wanted to mention briefly that it's been used by a few institutional pilot users. The first was the Nature Conservancy, which used the tool to support the Mexico RED project. This is a $30 million USAID funded RED readiness project. And among other things, that project established 6 large pilot sites comprised of hundreds of forest management units. And the Nature Conservancy used the forest conservation targeting tool to help select forest management units in those pilot sites for forest conservation investments. The tool has also been used a couple of times by the Inter-American Development Bank. The first use was to support an improved cook stoves project in Honduras. Most rural households in Honduras use traditional wood-fired cook stoves, and those cook stoves contribute to rampant deforestation. Honduras has the highest national rate of deforestation in Latin America, and they also contribute to indoor air pollution. So the IDB funds a project called Profagones. It's a $5 million project aimed at replacing traditional cook stoves with improved cook stoves that use less firewood and also generate less indoor air pollution. And so administrators of that project use our targeting tool to select administrative units in Honduras where they would focus the project's activities. Finally, the IDB also used the forest conservation targeting tool to support a separate forest conservation project in Honduras that was meant to address issues created by the pine bark beetle, which has caused lots of forest damage in the last 5 or 10 years in Honduras. Hundreds of thousands of hectares of forest in the country have been affected by the pine bark beetle, but this project only had funds for interventions in about 40,000 hectares. So they used the forest conservation targeting tool to help them understand where to focus those resources. So now I'm going to demonstrate the forest conservation targeting tool, which again can be found at this URL. So this is the forest conservation targeting tool. It has 3 main elements. It has a dashboard up here, it has a map interface here, and it has a toolbox which consists of 5 tools. There's also a box that allows you to display the nomenclature in English or in Spanish. I'm going to run through this demonstration in English. So let me just briefly describe what's in each of these 3 elements. So in the dashboard, there are 4 different pull-down menus, and the first 3 provide background information on the tool. So in the how-to menu, if you click on description, you get a PDF, a downloadable PDF that provides a brief overview of the data and the methods that the tool uses. Probably the most important link is to detailed instructions in the how-to menu. So if you have any questions that are not addressed in this video tutorial, which is pretty brief or relatively brief, hopefully you'll be able to find the answers in these more detailed written instructions. There are also frequently asked questions. There's a link to this video tutorial. There's a forum for user questions, and there's an email address that you can use if you have any questions or concerns about the tool. In the About menu, there's a PDF, a downloadable PDF that describes the metadata for the tool, the data that we're using. There's a list of the organizations that have sponsored the development of the tool, the team that developed the tool, and again, the same email address. We've included that in each of the first 3 pull-down menus in the dashboard. And finally, in the feedback menu, there's a forum for user questions and comments. The 4th pull-down menu is it gives you access to a portal where you can upload data to be used in combination with the onboard data for the forest conservation targeting tool, or that can completely substitute for those data. I'm not going to take the time to run through the use of this use your own data portal. I think it's pretty clear how to use it from the instructions, or just simply by clicking through the menus as you open the portal. So that's the dashboard. The map interface should be familiar to anybody who's ever used Google Maps or a similar program. There's a pan tool that allows you to navigate, move up and down, right and left. You can also, as you do in Google Maps, click and drag the map. There's also a zoom tool that allows you to zoom in or out. But you can also do that by using the scroll button on your mouse. If at any time you want to go back to the beginning, let's say you kind of got lost, and you wanted to go back to where you started, you can always hit this Reset All button in the lower left-hand corner of the Forest Conservation Targeting tool. So that's the map interface. The main way that users interact with the Forest Conservation Targeting tool is through the tools in this toolbox. The first tool has a number of different options for how data are displayed. So for example, the first option turns on or off the shape lines that define different spatial units of analysis. The second turns off the fill for those spatial units of analysis. I'm going to turn back on the line so you can see them. You can also choose the color that's used to fill in the spatial units of analysis. You can adjust the opacity of the spatial units of analysis that are filled. You can choose different base layers. So the default base layer is Google Physical Maps, which if you've used Google Maps, you're used to seeing. And if you zoom in, you have access to all of the data, roads and city names and topography that's in the Google Physical Maps layer. Alternative layers you can display are Google Satellite layer, the Google Hybrid layer, which is a hybrid between satellite and physical maps, Microsoft Bing Street Maps. You can also display forest loss data from the University of Maryland, forest loss between 2000 and 2012. I'm not going to take the time to do that. And then there are a number of other options for how data are displayed. The next tool allows the user to define the study area in which they want to conduct a spatial prioritization exercise. So the first thing that the user needs to do is indicate the country in which they want, or region within a country and where they want to focus, and also at the same time select the spatial unit of analysis. So the way to do that is to go to this data set pull down menu, and you can see the regions that are available for analysis and the spatial units of analysis. So for South America, as we discussed a minute ago, users can choose between using 10 kilometer squared cells or 1 kilometer squared cells as a spatial unit of analysis. For Mexico, the only choice is to use cadastral polygons, or predios, which means properties in Spanish. And for Central America, the user has three choices. They can use second level administrative units, the equivalent of counties in the United States, 10 kilometer cells or 1 kilometer cells. And finally, there's a choice to use as a study area the pilot areas for the Mexico RED project that I described a minute ago. This is really just a kind of a legacy of the way that the Forest Conservation Targeting tool was built. The initial iteration was built to support the Mexico RED project. And so on board, we have the boundaries of the pilot areas, the 6 pilot areas in Mexico for the MRED project. So for the purpose of demonstration, let's focus on Central America and uses our spatial unit of analysis, second level administrative units. When we select those units, we can go to this menu down here by administrative boundary and indicate which country we want to focus on. For the sake of convenience, let's look at El Salvador. And when we choose El Salvador, the map focuses on that country. So this just indicates the region in which we want our study area to be located. It's not necessarily the study area itself. So let's say that we want to focus on second level administrative units in the western part of El Salvador. There's 2 ways that we can indicate to the Forest Conservation Targeting tool that we want to include certain of those administrative units and not others. And we can do that by using the manual selection tool. There are 2 types of tools that we can use. We can use either a box tool or a polygon tool, and I'll demonstrate both of those. The simpler tool is the polygon tool. So I select polygon, and then I click on this submit, click on this begin selecting button. And then the pointer changes to this icon where we have a kind of circle where the pointer is pointing. And if I click, that defines the vertex, a vertex of a polygon. And if I click on all the vertices in which I'm interested, and then double click on the last vertex, that defines that polygon. And when I hit submit to server, this button over here, the Forest Conservation Targeting Tool is going to include in the study area all of the spatial units of analysis that intersect with that polygon. So let me demonstrate. Let's say I want all of the, to include in the study area all of the second level administrative units in the western part of El Salvador. So I'll just define a polygon that is going to intersect with all of those units. And if I double click on the last vertex, the polygon turns orange. And once I have an orange polygon, if I hit submit to server, the Forest Conservation Targeting Tool, again, is going to include all of the second level administrative units that intersect with that polygon. So that's one way of selecting a study area manually. A second way is to use the box tool. So the box tool provides more flexibility. The first thing that happens when you click on box tool is you get a message that tells you you can't use this tool if you have more than 10,000 spatial units of analysis in your study area because of computational constraints. We don't, so I'll just click OK. So when you click begin selecting, now the pointer doesn't change, but if you click and drag, you can map out a box, which is why this is called the box tool. And then when I raise my finger off of the mouse, the Forest Conservation Targeting Tool selects all of the spatial units that intersect with that box. But the thing that makes this tool more flexible is I can then deselect administrative units that have been selected, and I can do that by control clicking on those administrative units so they turn from orange back to green. And I can add administrative units that are not included in the original selection by shift clicking. So as you can see, you can kind of get an infinitely flexible study area by using this box tool. So once you're done making your selection, you hit submit to server and you end up with your study area. So I'm going to clear my selections, and I'm just for the sake of demonstration going to use all of El Salvador as the study area as I click through the remaining tools in the toolbox. So that's the second tool, the Define Study Area tool. The third tool, Targeting Data tool, just allows, one other thing I wanted to mention about the Define Study Area tool is that you can exclude or you can limit your study area to only spatial units of analysis that have a certain minimum percent forest cover. And this is percent forest cover as defined in the Hansen et al. 2013 data set, which is what we use for a variety of purposes in this tool, including, as I discussed a minute ago, and estimating deforestation risk. But you can do that by moving this slider. So if I move this slider up to 74% and then hit this go button, the study area is limited to spatial units that have had at least 74% forest cover in 2001. So let me go back to the original study area and then continue talking about this targeting data tool. So this targeting data tool displays the different spatial data layers on board. And this can be a useful input in itself for policymakers thinking about where to locate forest conservation policies. So without the tool calculating expected benefit per unit cost and suggesting various spatial units, it may be helpful to simply look at, for example, where forest carbon is the most rich within a study area, or where deforestation risk is highest. So to display these spatial data layers, first I'm going to go back up here and increase opacity just to make these colors easier to see. And all you need to do in order to display the layers is select a data layer. So for example, here's hydrological services, and then hit update dated visualization. And the tool will display the default display the data in 3 categories: low, middle, and high. It turns out to be easier to see, I think, if you display the data in quantiles. There are sharper definitions. So these hydrological services data are fairly coarse spatially, and that's because they're estimated at the watershed level. Let's look at another data layer. Here's deforestation risk. And here again, you can see the high values are displayed in red, the low values are in blue, and the values in the middle are in purple. We'll look at one more. Here are opportunity costs. Again, high values in red and low values in blue. So that's just a quick demo of the targeting data tool. We'll clear those data, and then we'll go to the 4th tool, which is the one that allows you to access the main functionality of the web tool, which is identifying those spatial units of analysis where forest conservation is going to generate the greatest bang for the buck. So there are a number of different steps in getting the tool to display those information. The first one is choosing which data layers to use in measuring the forest carbon. So for forest carbon, we have a choice between using data on non-soil carbon, or basically above ground biomass, below ground biomass, or the sum of those two. The default is above ground biomass or non-soil carbon. We'll stick with that. For biodiversity, we can use 3 different measures. We can use a simple count of threatened species, threatened and endangered species. We can use a rarity weighted richness index, where the weights are based on rarity defined nationally or rarity defined globally. The default is the global rarity weighted richness index, and we'll stick with that. So having chosen benefit variables, the next thing to do is to define a budget, a conservation budget. The default is 10% of the total opportunity cost of all of the spatial units of analysis in the study area. So the forest conservation targeting tool knows the opportunity cost, the total opportunity cost of forest conservation in each of these units, and it sums that for all of these units and takes 10% of that total. That's the default budget. Alternatively, you could define a budget in terms of US dollars and enter that information in this box, but we'll stick with the default of 10%. The next thing to do is to weight the benefits. Remember that the forest conservation targeting tool takes into account 3 different types of ecological benefits: forest carbon, provision of biodiversity habitat, and provision of hydrological services. So the default is to weight these things, these 3 things equally. Alternatively, instead of doing that, users can choose their own weights. So for example, if a user wanted to put all of the weight on carbon, you could either enter, these are decimals that add to 1. You could either change these decimals, or you could make the adjustment using this slider. So red represents biodiversity, green carbon, and blue hydrological services. And the length of each of these line segments determines the weight. So here the weights are equal. Alternatively, if I want to put all of the weight on carbon, I could move the slider accordingly. Here's all of the weight on biodiversity and all of the weight on provision of hydrological services. So we'll return to the default of equal weights. And finally, we give users the option to completely discount certain elements of expected benefit per unit cost. So, and that's what these three click buttons here are. This one allows the user to not take into account deforestation risk. This one allows the user to not take into account conservation costs. So the default is to include both of those two things, and we'll stick with that. So having made those choices, the benefit variables, the budget, the weights, and whether or not to include various elements of the expected benefit per unit cost, the next step is to click this Submit Update button, and the tool will display those units that generate the greatest benefit per unit cost. So those are the second level administrative units that the tool is suggesting that we target. Let's see what happens if we change the budget. So if we change the budget from 10% of the total opportunity cost for the entire study area to 20%, as you would expect, the tool will recommend that we conserve forests in more spatial units. Let's go back to 10%. If we change the weights on the three ecological benefits, we'll get different spatial units suggested. So if we put all of the weight on biodiversity, the tool suggests a different set of administrative units. If we put all of the weight on forest carbon, it suggests yet another different set. And finally, if we put all of the weight on provision of hydrological services, it suggests a third set. So a natural question is, are there any spatial units, any second level administrative units that would be chosen regardless of the weight that we place on those three ecological benefits? If we click this Compare tab, that's what this Compare functionality tells us. We hit Compare and then Submit Update. And the second level administrative units that would be selected regardless of the weights are identified in white with crosshatches. As you can see, there's only one second level administrative unit that meets that criteria. The legend explains what the other selected units are. So the yellow ones are, or the light green ones are the units that are selected if we only care about carbon. The red units are those selected if we only care about biodiversity. Blue if we only care about hydrological services. Yellow if we care about carbon and biodiversity equally, and so forth. So that is the basic functioning of the forest conservation targeting tool. The last remaining menu is the tool. The last remaining tool is the export tool, which allows us to download results from our targeting analysis either as a shapefile, as a CSV worksheet, or as a PDF of a map. So that's the end of the web tutorial for the first of our two web tools. Thank you for your attention. I hope this tutorial was helpful. If you have questions that were not addressed in this video, please consult the detailed instructions available for download in the dashboard of the tool, or write to us at the email address, which is also in the dashboard of the tool. Finally, if you're interested in the web tutorial for the second tool, the Forest Conservation Evaluation tool, please go to the URL for that tool mentioned in the beginning of this video. Again, that URL is fcet.severeglobal.net. Thank you.